Many network switches, especially 10 gigabit switches, sometimes contain fans that are pretty loud. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I replaced my native YS Tech fans in my switch with ultra-quiet Noctua fans. If you're interested in learning how to do this, then stick around for the rest of this video. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe, as it really does help support the channel. As I'm getting ready for some network upgrades and some reconfiguring for 2021, I wanted to replace my QNAP unmanaged 10 gigabit switch in my top rack with a managed one and relocate that one down to a lower rack. As this was ultimately going to be closer to me, I wanted to make sure that these were quiet as possible. To clarify, though I'm using a QNAP switch to perform this modification, this process really applies to most equipment that has fans. To baseline the noise level, this is the only device in my top rack that has a fan, so the sound readings were taken about an inch from the switch, kind of directly in front of the fans, as well as random locations inside the rack, just to see if there was any reflective sounds as I moved around. At the loudest point during my testing, once the fans reached maximum RPM, was around 68 dB, and that was pretty much directly in front of the fans. On the surface, just putting in quieter fans sounds pretty simple, but there's a few things you need to take into consideration so that you don't damage your equipment. As a warning, kind of only do this mod if you're comfortable with what you're doing and kind of understand the process. Otherwise, you could really damage your equipment. One of the first things that we need to do is to take a look and see if we can look up the specs of the fans that you're removing. If the specs aren't listed anywhere in the documentation, we'll have to remove the fan so that we can get to the specs listed on the label or get the manufacturer's part number so we can look it up. Manufacturers use custom variations of standard fans or use a slightly different part number kind of as a differentiator. They might use a different letter or something at the end of the part number. So you may not find the exact match you're looking for, but hopefully you'll get something that's really close. In my case, I couldn't find the 4-wire version specifications, but I did find the same fan in a 3-wire configuration, so I was able to get all the specs I needed to find a match. If you remove the fan, you should be able to get at least some of the critical information labeled right on it. At a minimum, you're going to need to know the voltage, the current, and hopefully there'll be enough information so that you can look up the CFM, which is the amount of airflow. Again, those are usually related somewhat close to the current and power that the fan's drawing. So when you're looking at the fans, the current and the voltage really have to match. It's okay to install a fan that draws a little bit less current, but you should avoid a fan that requires more current. And the main reason for that is it may, depending on how it's hooked up, whether it's hooked up directly to a power supply or whether it's hooked up to a circuit board, you may draw more current than you want. It may damage your equipment. As best practice, you also want to make sure that the replacement fan is the same wire configuration, such as the 4-pin PWM, so that you don't lose any functionality. You can get away with putting a 3-pin into a 4-pin configuration, but the fan will spin at maximum RPM all the time, and you'll lose the speed adjustment functionality, so you don't really want to do that. Before we get started, as a rule of thumb, when replacing fans, 99% of the time I really purchase Noctua fans for two basic reasons. One is they're very, very quiet, and the other is they're super reliable. For fan sizes that are less than 80 millimeter, I probably won't consider anything but Noctua fans, unless I really can't find a match. For larger than 80 millimeter fans, there's a few options, but most of the time I still opt for Noctuas. They just never have let me down. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and remove the old fans from the switch. We're going to start by taking the device apart and looking inside to see what kind of fans are in there. On this particular device, there's quite a few screws to be removed, including the rack mount brackets. Once we get the top cover off, we can now see the factory fan configuration. I want to remove one of the fans and actually measure the sound level so that it can be compared to the new Noctua fans before we get carried away and complete the teardown. As you can see from the sound meter, the reading is about 61.7 dB on the factory fan. Now we'll hook up the Noctua fan and verify that it's a bit quieter, measuring around 53.7 dB. And again, this is also on top of the room ambient noise. Now that we've established that these new fans are a lot quieter, let's go ahead and replace both fans, reassemble the cover so we can run some sound measurements once it's back into the rack. When you put the new fans in, you're going to want to make sure that you orientate the fan in the same direction as the old one so that you don't change the direction of airflow. As we go through and replace these fans, there's a couple things I want to point out. First of all, that all the sound measurements that we've taken so far and that will be taken going forward include the room ambient noise, so you're not seeing the same exact reading that you're going to see on the manufacturer's documentation. Secondly, we're measuring levels of only one fan, so when you consider there'll be two fans, the overall sound reduction will be pretty significant. Lastly, the sound readings that were taken on the individual fans were done at a maximum RPM on both the original fan and the Noctua fan, so we can establish kind of a worst case scenario. So this is what it looks like when you've actually mounted both fans and you've got everything ready to run. As you can see, the wires are a little bit longer, but we can tuck those away nicely and there's plenty of room in this case. Once we've got them installed and we verified that they're working, we can now reassemble the top cover on the switch so we can do some sound level testing on the entire system, as well as verify the switch is being cooled properly, because that's obviously very critical. I'm going to go ahead and put everything back in the rack, and we'll take a look at a quick sound measurement and compare it to the original 68 dB. During my testing, the fans never reached the maximum RPM, and the average RPM was about 10% lower than what I saw in the original factory fans, which tells me that the new fans are actually moving more air, despite being significantly quieter. In summary, I couldn't be happier with the results I got, and running two of these similar switches in my office with these new fans is no longer causing me any issues with noise. Though these fans aren't cheap, in the long run they're well worth it. They're super quiet, they move more air, and they're a lot more reliable. The mods took me about 30 to 40 minutes per switch, and it was pretty straightforward, just a lot of screws. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, please throw it a like. If you haven't already done so, then hit that subscribe button, as it really helps support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.